Dracula begins with the diary kept by Jonathan Harker, an English solicitor, or lawyer, as he makes his way from England to Eastern Europe. Embarking on his first professional assignment as a solicitor, Harker is traveling to the castle of Count Dracula, a Transylvanian nobleman. Harker hopes to conclude a real estate deal to sell Count Dracula a residence in London. Harker plans to take copious notes throughout his journey so that he can share the details of his adventures with his fiancée copyrightee, Mina Murray. In his first diary entry, on May 3, Harker describes the picturesque countryside of Eastern Europe and the exotic food he has tasted at the roadside inns. He notes several recipes that he plans to obtain for Mina. Harker arrives in the northern Romanian town of Bistrița and checks into a hotel Count Dracula has recommended to him. The innkeeper gives Harker a letter from the Count. The letter welcomes Harker to the beautiful Carpathian Mountains and informs him that he should take the next day's coach to the Borgo Pass, where a carriage will meet him to bring him the rest of the way to the castle. As Harker prepares to leave the next morning, the innkeeper's wife delivers an ominous warning. She reminds Harker that it is the eve of St. George's Day, when all the evil things in the world will have full sway. She then puts a crucifix around his neck. Though he is a practicing Anglican who regards Catholic paraphernalia as somewhat idolatrous, Harker politely accepts the crucifix. He is somewhat disturbed by this exchange, however, and his uneasiness increases when a crowd of peasants gathers around the inn as he boards the coach. They mutter many queer words at Harker, which, with the help of his dictionary, he translates to mean werewolf or vampire. As the coach departs, everyone in the crowd makes the sign of the cross in his direction, a gesture that a fellow passenger explains is meant to protect him from the evil eye. The journey to the Borgo Pass takes Harker through incomparably beautiful country. At dusk, he passes by quaintly attired peasants kneeling in prayer at roadside shrines. As darkness falls, the other passengers become restless, urging the coachman to quicken their speed. The driver whips the horses into a frenzy and the coach rockets along the mountain road. One by one, the passengers begin to offer Harker small gifts and tokens that he assumes are also meant to ward off the evil eye. The coach soon arrives at the Borgo Pass, but there is no carriage waiting to ferry Harker to his final destination. Just as the driver offers to bring Harker back to the pass the next day, however, a small, horse-drawn carriage arrives. Harker boards the carriage and continues toward the castle. He has the impression that the carriage is covering the same ground over and over again, and he grows increasingly fearful as the ride progresses. Harker is spooked several times by the wild howling of wolves. At one point, Harker looks outside the carriage and sees a flickering blue flame burning somewhere in the distance. The driver pulls over without explanation, inspects the flame, then returns to the carriage and continues on. Harker recounts several more stops to inspect similar flames and notes that at one point, when the driver gathers a few stones around one of the flames, he seems to be able to see the flame through the driver's body. Eventually, Harker arrives, paralyzed by fear, at the dark and ruined castle. Jonathan Harker stands outside Dracula's remarkable castle, wondering what sort of adventure he has gotten himself into. After a long wait, the Count appears and welcomes Harker. Clad in black, he is a tall old man, who is clean-shaven aside from a long, white mustache. When the two shake hands, Harker is impressed by the strength of Dracula's grip, but notes that the ice-cold hand is more like that of a dead man than a living one. Still, the Count's greeting is so warm that the Englishman's fears vanish. Harker enters and takes his dinner before a roaring fire. As the two converse, Harker notices what calls Dracula's marked physiognomy. The Count has pointed ears, exceptionally pale skin, and extremely sharp teeth. Harker's nervousness and fears return. The next day, Harker wakes to find a note from Dracula, excusing himself for the day. Left to himself, Harker enjoys a hearty meal and, encountering no servants in the castle, explores his bedroom and the unlocked room adjacent to it. He sees expensive furniture, rich tapestries and fabrics, and a library filled with reading material in English, but notes that there are no mirrors to be found anywhere. That evening, Dracula joins Harker for conversation in the library, as he is eager to learn inflections of English speech before moving to his new estate. The men discuss the pervasiveness of evil spirits in Transylvania. Harker describes the house that the Count has purchased. It is an old mansion called Carfax, quite isolated, with only a lunatic asylum and an old chapel nearby. Dracula draws out the conversation long into the night, but abruptly leaves his guest at daybreak. The Count's strange behavior increases Harker's sense of uneasiness. The next day, Dracula interrupts Harker shaving. Harker is startled and accidentally cuts himself. Glancing at his shaving mirror, he notices that the Count has no reflection. Harker is also startled by Dracula's reaction to the sight of his blood. The Count lunges for his guest's throat, drawing back only after touching the string of beads that holds Harker's crucifix. After warning Harker against cutting himself in this country, Dracula throws the shaving mirror out a window. Left alone, Harker eats breakfast, noting that he has never seen his host eat or drink. His suspicions aroused, he once again goes exploring, only to discover one locked door after another. Harker realizes he is a prisoner in the Count's castle. That night, Harker questions his host about the history of Transylvania. Dracula speaks enthusiastically of the country's people and battles, and he boasts of the glories of his family name. Over the course of the next several days, the Count, in turn, grills Harker about matters of English life and law. He tells Harker to write letters to his fiancée copyrightee and employer, telling them that he will extend his stay in Transylvania by a month. Feeling obliged to his firm and overpowered by the Count, Harker agrees. Preparing to take his leave for the evening, Dracula warns his guest never to fall asleep anywhere in the castle other than his own room. Harker hangs his crucifix above his bed and, satisfied that the Count has departed, sets out to explore the castle. Peering out a window, Harker observes Dracula crawling down the sheer face of the castle. He wonders what kind of creature the Count is and fears that there will be no escape. One evening soon thereafter, Harker forces a locked room open and falls asleep, not heeding the Count's warning. Harker is visited whether in a dream or not, he cannot sire by three beautiful women with inhumanly red lips and sharp teeth. The women approach him, filling him with a wicked, burning desire. Just as one of the voluptuous women bends and places her lips against his neck, Dracula sweeps in, ordering the woman to leave Harker alone. "When I am done with him you shall kiss him at your will," the Count tells them. To appease the disappointed trio, Dracula offers them a bag containing a small, half-smothered child. The terrible women seem to fade out of the room as Harker drifts into unconsciousness. Harker wakes up in his own bed, unsure whether the previous night's experience was a dream or reality. Several days later, Dracula asks Harker to write 3 letters to his fiancée copyrightee and employer, and to date them June 12th, 19th, and 29th. Even though it is currently only May 19th, the Count instructs Harker to write that he has left the castle and is safely on his way home. Meanwhile, a party of gypsies has come to the castle, and Harker, hoping for a chance to escape, resolves to ask them to send a letter to Mina. Harker passes his secret correspondence to a gypsy through the bars of his window. Later that evening, Dracula appears with the letter in hand, declaring that it is a vile outrage upon his friendship and hospitality, and burns it. Weeks pass. It is now mid-June, and Harker remains a prisoner. More gypsies arrive at the castle, and Harker sees them unloading large wooden boxes from a wagon. One day, having discovered that several articles of his clothing have disappeared for some new scheme of villainy, Harker witnesses the Count slithering down the castle while wearing Harker's suit. Dracula carries a bundle much like the one earlier devoured by the 3 terrible women, which convinces Harker that his host is using the disguise to commit unspeakable deeds. Later that day, a distraught woman appears at the castle gate, wailing for her child. A pack of wolves emerges from the courtyard and devours her. Desperate, Harker resolves to scale a portion of the castle wall in order to reach Dracula's room during the day. He manages the feat and finds the Count's room empty except for a heap of gold. Discovering a dark, winding stairway, Harker follows it and encounters 50 boxes of earth in a tunnel-like passage. Harker opens several of the boxes and discovers the Count in one of them, either dead or asleep. Terrified, Harker flees back to his room. On June 29th, Dracula promises Harker that he can leave the next day, but Harker requests to leave immediately. Though his host agrees and opens the front door, Harker's departure is impeded by a waiting pack of wolves. Later, overhearing the Count say, "Tonight is mine, tomorrow night is yours," Harker opens his bedroom door to find the three voluptuous women. He returns to his room and prays for his safety. In the morning, Harker wakes early and climbs down to the Count's room again. Dracula is asleep as before, but looks younger and sleeker, and Harker notices blood trickling down from the corners of his mouth. Harker takes up a shovel, meaning to kill the vampire, but the blow glances harmlessly off the Count's forehead. Harker resolves to take some of Dracula's gold and attempt to escape by descending the castle wall. His entry ends with a desperate, "Goodbye, all." Mina. Chapter 5 consists of several letters and a diary entry. In England, Mina Murray and her friend, Lucy Westenra, exchange letters about their respective romances. Mina is an assistant schoolmistress whose desire to be useful to her future husband has led her to study shorthand and typewriting. She happily reports that her fiancé copyright, Jonathan Harker, has written that he is on his way home. Lucy replies with tales of her own marriage prospects. She has entertained proposals from several men, including Dr. John Seward, the director of a lunatic asylum in London, and a rich American named Quincy Morris. Her heart, however, belongs to a gentleman named Arthur Holmwood, whose proposal she has accepted. The women's correspondence is followed by a diary entry, on phonograph, by Dr. Seward. The doctor admits his unhappiness at Lucy's rebuff, but occupies himself with an interesting new patient, a man named Renfield. Following this entry is a congratulatory letter from Quincy Morris to Arthur Holmwood. In her journal, Mina describes her visit with Lucy in the picturesque town of Whitby, on the northeast coast of England, and the ruined abbey there that is reputed to be haunted. Mr. Swales, an elderly resident who befriends the two girls and tells them stories about the town, scoffs at such legends. Mr. Swales asserts that most of the graves in the Whitby churchyard are empty, as their supposed occupants were lost at sea. After Swales departs, Mina listens to Lucy's wedding plans and notes sadly that she has not heard from Jonathan for a month. John Seward continues to report the curious case of Renfield in his diary. The patient has the curious habit of consuming living creatures. He uses sugar to trap flies, uses flies to trap spiders, and uses spiders to trap sparrows. He delights as one creature consumes another and believes that he himself draws strength by eating these creatures. Seward classifies Renfield as a tildepilecrophagosa or life-eating maniac who desires to absorb as many lives as he can. Meanwhile, Mina expresses anxiety over her missing fiancé copyright and over Lucy, who has begun to sleepwalk during the night. Although she seems healthy, Lucy exhibits an odd concentration that Mina does not understand. While out walking one day, Mina encounters Mr. Swales, who tells her that he senses his own death is likely not far off. He assures her that he is not afraid of dying and that death is all that we can rightly depend on. Mina and Mr. Swales see a ship drifting about offshore as if no one were at the helm, guessing the vessel to be Russian, by the look of her. Mr. Swales assures Mina that they will surely hear more about it. Two newspaper clippings indicate that the ship Mina and Mr. Swales have seen, a vessel called the Demeter, later washes up on the shore at Whitby during a terrific storm. Its crew is nowhere to be found, while its captain, dead and clasping a crucifix, is discovered tied to the wheel. When the ship runs aground, a huge dog leaps from the hold and disappears into the countryside. The Demeter's only cargo is a number of large wooden boxes, which are delivered to a Whitby solicitor. Selections from the captain's log of the Demeter follow, describing the ship's voyage to England from the Russian port of Varna. The trip starts off well, but 10 days into the voyage, a crew member is found missing. Soon thereafter, another sailor spots a tall, thin man who is not like any of the crew. A search of the ship finds no stowaways, but every few days another sailor disappears. The crew becomes numb with fear, and the first mate begins to go mad. By the time the ship reaches the English coast, only 4 men remain to sail it. A great fog settles over them, preventing them from reaching harbor. After 2 more sailors vanish, The first mate goes below to find the intruder, only to rush out of the hold and throw himself into the sea. That night, in order to baffle this fiend or monster, the captain resolves to lash himself and his crucifix to the wheel and to stay with his ship to the end. The narrative returns to Mina's journal. Mina describes the night of the dreaded storm, her fears for Jonathan, and her concern for Lucy, who continues to sleepwalk. On the day of the sea captain's funeral, Mina reports that Lucy is increasingly restless. One reason for Lucy's agitation, Mina believes, is the recent death of Mr. Swales, who was found dead with a broken neck and a look of horror on his face. On August 10th, Mina awakens to find Lucy's bed empty. She goes outside to find Lucy and sees her in the churchyard, reclining on her favorite bench with a dark figure bending over her. As Mina approaches, the figure looks toward her, exposing a pale face and gleaming red eyes. By the time Mina reaches Lucy, however, the figure is gone. Lucy is apparently asleep but gasping for breath, so Mina wraps her in a shawl and leads her home. When Lucy wakes, Mina finds two little red points like pinpricks on her friend's neck, and decides that she must have accidentally pricked Lucy while helping her pin her shawl. Lucy attempts to sleepwalk again the following 2 nights, but Mina thwarts Lucy's efforts by locking the bedroom door. Later, the two women go for a walk together. As the sun sets, they see a dark figure in the graveyard, and Lucy comments on the red glint of his eyes. That night, Mina awakes to find Lucy sitting up in bed, pointing to the window. Mina looks outside and sees a large bat fluttering in the moonlight. When she turns around, she finds Lucy sleeping peacefully. During the next few days, Lucy grows pale and haggard, and the puncture wounds at her throat grow larger. Mina worries about the well-being of her friends, about Lucy's failing health, about Lucy's mother, who is too ill to bear any anxiety over Lucy's state, and about the still missing Jonathan Harker. Mina's journal entry is followed by a letter from a Whitby solicitor, ordering the boxes of earth from the Demeter to be delivered to the estate of Carfax, the house Dracula has purchased. We return to Mina's diary, where she writes that Lucy's health seems to be improving. News comes that Jonathan has appeared in a Hungarian hospital in Budapest, suffering from brain fever. Mina prepares to leave England to be with Jonathan. The narrative shifts to John Seward's accounts of his patient Renfield, who has grown both violent and boastful, telling the doctor that the master is at hand. One night, Renfield escapes and runs to Carfax, where Dr. Seward finds him pressing against the door of the mansion's chapel, calling out to his master and promising obedience. The attendants return Renfield to his cell, where he begs his master to be patient. Mina writes from Budapest, telling Lucy that Jonathan has changed greatly. He is a wreck of himself and remembers nothing of his time in Transylvania. The nun tending to Jonathan confides in Mina that he often raves deliriously about unspeakable things. Jonathan is still in possession of his diary and knows that the cause of his brain fever is recorded in it. He turns the diary over to Mina, making her promise that she will never mention what is written there unless some solemn duty requires it. The couple decides to marry immediately, and Mina seals the diary shut with wax, promising never to open it except in a dire emergency. Lucy sends Mina a letter of congratulation. Meanwhile, Renfield has become more docile, repeatedly mumbling, "I can wait, I can wait." A few days later, however, he escapes again and turns up once more at the door of the chapel at Carfax. When Dr. John Seward follows with his attendants, Renfield moves to attack, but grows calm at the sight of a great bat sweeping across the face of the moon. Lucy begins a diary, in which she records bad dreams and recounts that something scratches at her window in the night. Concerned that Lucy has become pale and weak again, Arthur Holmwood writes to Dr. Seward, asking him to examine her. Seward does so, and reports that Lucy's illness is beyond his experience. He sends for his former teacher, the celebrated Professor Van Helsing of Amsterdam, to examine the girl. Van Helsing arrives, observes Lucy, and then returns home briefly, asking to be kept abreast of Lucy's condition by telegram. He tells Seward that he cannot ascertain the cause of Lucy's illness, but concurs that much of her blood has been lost. Renfield, meanwhile, resumes his habit of catching flies. However, when the doctor comes to see Renfield at sunset, he tosses out his flies, claiming that he is sick of all that rubbish. Lucy seems to show improvement for a few days, as Seward's telegrams to Van Helsing relate. On September 6, however, there is a terrible change for the worse, and the doctor begs his old master to come immediately. Seward and Holmwood are concerned about Lucy's suddenly failing health. When Van Helsing arrives to find Lucy terribly pale and unable to breathe easily, he transfuses Holmwood's blood into Lucy. The doctors examine the punctures on Lucy's neck. Though Seward is convinced that these wounds caused her severe loss of blood, he can offer no explanation for them. Van Helsing orders Seward to stay up with Lucy that night. The young doctor does so, and Lucy awakes feeling much restored. The following night, however, the exhausted Seward falls asleep on his watch. The next morning, he and Van Helsing find Lucy pale and completely drained of strength, her gums shrunken and her lips wide. Seward performs another transfusion, this time providing the blood himself. Attempting to sleep, Seward wakes to thoughts of the punctures on Lucy's neck and the ragged appearance of their edges. That afternoon, a large package arrives for Van Helsing. It contains white garlic flowers, which Van Helsing orders Lucy to wear around her neck. Under the skeptical gaze of Seward, Van Helsing places garlic flowers all around the room and leaves Lucy, assuring Seward that she will now be able to sleep safely. In the morning, Van Helsing and Dr. Seward return to the West Henry residence. They are greeted by Lucy's mother, who tells them that during the night she removed all the horrible, strong-smelling flowers from Lucy's room and opened the windows to let in fresh air. After Mrs. West Henry leaves the room, Van Helsing nearly crumbles. He and Seward rush to their patient to find her near death. Only another blood transfusion from Van Helsing resuscitates her. Van Helsing warns Mrs. West Henry never to remove anything from Lucy's room again. For the next 4 days all is well, and Lucy reports that she feels much better. A clipping from the Pall Mall Gazette reports that the large wolf escaped from the zoological gardens. The animal returns the next morning, covered in broken glass. Seward's September 17 diary entry reports that Renfield attacks the young doctor in his office, and cuts the doctor's wrist. Renfield proceeds to lick up the blood, and repeats, over and over, the phrase, "The blood is alive." Van Helsing telegrams Seward that day, advising him to spend the night with Lucy, but there is a delay and the message does not arrive until the following morning. On September 17, the night of the wolf's escape, Lucy awakens, frightened by a flapping at the window and a howling outside. Mrs. West Henry is also scared by the noise and comes in and joins her daughter in bed. Suddenly, the window shatters and the head of a huge wolf appears. Terrified, Lucy's mother tears the garlic wreath from her daughter's neck and suffers a fatal heart attack. As Lucy loses consciousness, she sees the wolf draw his head back from the window. The 4 household maids enter, horrified by the sight of their dead mistress. The women go into the dining room to have a glass of wine, but the wine is drugged and they all pass out. Left defenseless and alone, Lucy hides her latest diary entry in her bodice, hoping that they shall find it when they come to lay me out. The narrative returns to Seward's diary entries. Arriving at the West Henrys the next day, Van Helsing and Seward find the scene of destruction, the maids unconscious on the dining room floor, Mrs. West Henry dead, and Lucy once again at death's door, with terrible, mangled wounds at her neck. Neither of the men can spare any more blood, but Lucy's third suitor, Quincy Morris, appears and agrees to take part in a transfusion. Puzzled, Morris asks what has become of all the blood that has already been transferred to Lucy. Holmwood arrives. His father's recent death, combined with the loss of Mrs. West Henry and Lucy's failing health, nearly makes him despondent, but his presence helps rally his fiancée to copyright his spirits. Unaware of what has befallen Lucy, Mona writes a letter informing Lucy that she and Jonathan have married and have returned to England. Dr. Seward's assistant writes to tell him that Renfield escaped again and attacked 2 men carrying boxes of earth from Carfax. Van Helsing surrounds his dying patient with garlic, but she pushes the flowers away as she sleeps. When Seward checks on Lucy during the night, he notices a bat hovering near her window. On the morning of September 20th, the wounds on Lucy's neck disappear. Sensing that Lucy is nearing the end of her life, the doctors awaken Holmwood and bring him to say goodbye. In a strangely seductive voice, Lucy begs Holmwood to kiss her, but Van Helsing pulls him away, instructing him to kiss Lucy only on the forehead. Holmwood complies with Van Helsing's instructions, and Lucy dies, recovering in death the beauty that she lost during her long illness. Seward's diary continues, as he describes Lucy's burial. Before the funeral, Van Helsing covers the coffin and body with garlic and places a crucifix in Lucy's mouth. He tells a confused Seward that after the funeral, they must cut off Lucy's head and take out her heart. The next day, however, Van Helsing discovers that someone has stolen the crucifix from the body and tells Seward that they will have to wait before doing anything more. The heartbroken Holmwood, referred to as Lord Godalming since his father's death, turns to Seward for consolation. Looking at Lucy's unnaturally lovely corpse, Holmwood cannot believe she is really dead. Van Helsing asks Holmwood for Lucy's personal papers, hoping that they will provide some clue as to the cause of her death. Meanwhile, Mina writes in her diary that in London she and Jonathan have seen a tall, fierce man with the black mustache and beard. Jonathan is convinced the man is Count Dracula. Jonathan becomes so upset that he slips into a deep sleep and remembers nothing when he wakes. Mina decides that, for the sake of her husband's health, she must read his diary entries from his time in Transylvania. That night, Mina receives a telegram informing her of Lucy's death. This message is followed by an excerpt from a local paper, which reports that a number of children have been temporarily abducted in Hampstead Heath, the area where Lucy was buried, by a strange woman whom the children call the Blue-fur Lady. When the children return home, they bear strange wounds on their necks. Transcribing her husband's journal, Mina is horrified by its contents. When Van Helsing visits Mina in order to discuss the events leading up to Lucy's death, she is so impressed that she gives him Jonathan's diary to read. Van Helsing reads the diary and returns to see the couple at breakfast the next day. Van Helsing's belief in Jonathan's observations rests towards the young man's memories of his time in Transylvania. Realizing that Dracula must indeed have journeyed to England, Harker begins a new diary. Seward reports that Renfield has returned to his habit of catching flies and spiders. Van Helsing visits the young doctor and points out the newspaper accounts of the Blue-fur Lady, taking care to note that the abducted children always reappear with wounds on their necks similar to those that appeared on Lucy's neck. Seward is skeptical of any connection, but his mentor urges him to believe in the possibility of the supernatural, of occurrences that cannot be explained by reason. Van Helsing suddenly concludes that it must be Lucy who is responsible for the marks on the children's necks. Seward is appalled by Van Helsing's suggestion that Lucy is in some way responsible for the rash of wounded children. However, due to his respect for the elder doctor, he accompanies Van Helsing on his investigation. The two men visit one of the wounded children and find that the marks on the child's neck are identical to Lucy's. That night, Seward and Van Helsing proceed to Lucy's tomb, open the coffin, and find it empty. Seward suggests that a grave robber might have taken the corpse, but Van Helsing instructs him to keep watch at one side of the churchyard. Near dawn, Seward witnesses a white streak moving between the trees. He and Van Helsing approach and find a child lying nearby, but Seward still refuses to believe that Lucy is responsible for any wrongdoing. Only after they return to Lucy's tomb, finding her restored to her coffin and radiantly beautiful, does Seward feel the horrid sense of the reality of things. Van Helsing explains that Lucy belongs to the undead and insists that she must be decapitated, her mouth filled with garlic, and a stake driven through her heart. The two men meet with Arthur Holmwood and Quincy Morris, and Van Helsing explains what must be done. Holmwood is opposed to mutilating his fiancée to copyright his corpse, but finally agrees to accompany them to the graveyard. That night, the four men go to Lucy's grave and find it empty. Van Helsing seals the door of the tomb with communion wafers to prevent the vampire Lucy from re-entering. The men then hide and wait. Eventually, a figure appears, dressed entirely in white and carrying a child. It is Lucy, or rather, a monster that looks like Lucy, with eyes unclean and full of hellfire and a mouth stained with fresh blood. As the men surround her, she drops the child and calls out passionately to Holmwood, telling him to come to her. Holmwood begins to move, but Van Helsing leaps between the couple and brandishes a crucifix. Lucy recoils. Van Helsing quickly removes the communion wafers, and the vampire slips through the door of her tomb. Having witnessed this horror, Holmwood concurs that the necessary rites must be performed, and the following evening, he returns to hammer a stake through Lucy's heart. As Lucy returns to a state of beauty, Van Helsing reassures Holmwood that he has saved Lucy's soul from eternal darkness and has given her peace at last. Before leaving the tomb, Van Helsing makes plans to reunite with the men 2 nights later, so that they may discuss the terrible task before them. At Van Helsing's urging, Jonathan and Mina Harker come to stay with Seward at the asylum. Mina transcribes Seward's diary with the typewriter and notes its account of Lucy's death. Meanwhile, Seward reads the Harkers' journals, realizing for the first time that Dracula may well be his next-door neighbor and that there may be a connection between the vampire's proximity and Renfield's behavior. The lunatic Renfield is calm at the moment, and Seward wonders what this tranquility indicates about Dracula's whereabouts.